There is a village in the Cotswolds where the river Windrush bends through water meadows and dry stone walls, and where on a grey October morning the air over the valley smells of wood smoke and damp leaves and the cold gravel of country church paths. And if you walk the half-mile from the village pub, up the lane toward the edge of the hill, past a gate and a paddock, and a row of 19th-century estate cottages, you will reach a churchyard with 6 graves arranged in an uneven row. 4 of them belong to sisters. 2 belong to a sister and her mother. The 7th sibling, a son, is buried in Burma, and the house they grew up in, a square grey stone manor with 7 chimneys that their father built in 1926 because he had sold the one they really loved, stands a field away across the Windrush, privately owned, closed to visitors, and still hated, posthumously, by every daughter who ever lived inside it. This is Swinbrook in Oxfordshire. And the sisters in the graveyard are the Mitfords. There were 6 of them: Nancy, born 1904, Pamela, 1907, Diana, 1910, Unity, 1914, Jessica, 1917, Deborah, 1920. Between them, they produced a Prime Minister's wife, 2 best-selling novelists, a Duchess, a communist émigré, a confidante of Adolf Hitler, the second wife of the leader of the British Union of Fascists, and an investigative muckraker who exposed the American funeral industry. Their only brother, Tom, was killed in action in Burma in 1945 at the age of 36. Their father, Lord Redesdale, went bankrupt trying to keep them in country houses. Their mother, Sydney, outlived 5 of her 7 children, and the 2 houses most closely associated with the family, Asthall Manor and Swinbrook House, are the Cotswold addresses behind the most politically compromising, most darkly comic, and most systematically heartbroken aristocratic family of 20th century England. They photograph the outside of Swinbrook House from across the river. They visit the graves at St Mary's. They buy Mitford biographies in the Burford bookshops. They drink in the Swan Inn, which the family used to visit, and which Deborah bought in 2003 so that it would not be turned into a theme pub. And almost none of them ask the question that the 2 Cotswold houses and the row of graves seem to insist upon. How did this happen inside one family? Not a royal family, not an ancient one, not a particularly rich one. The Mitfords were minor English landed aristocracy, Cotswold sheep farmers who had married well, an uncle who had founded the Lady magazine, a family on the edges of London society that should, by every rule of aristocratic averages, have produced 6 daughters indistinguishable from the daughters of a dozen other undistinguished barons. Instead, they produced 6 of the most famous sisters of the 20th century, and a brother whose death on a Burmese ridge in 1945 tore the last thread of civil speech between them. They lived in a series of ugly and beloved Cotswold houses. They read each other's letters. They ate each other's boiled eggs, and they drew their private wounds on a scale so large that the century could never quite cover them. The Mitford sisters are one of the most written about families in 20th century British history. There are 30 serious biographies. There are 4 editions of the sisters' collected letters. There are 2 television adaptations of Nancy's novels. There are podcasts. There are stage plays. There is a cottage industry of memoirs, memoirs of memoirs, and memoirs about memoirs. It is also one of the saddest families in 20th century British history, because behind the wit and the nicknames and the private language that the sisters called Boudledidge, and behind Nancy's laughter and Debo's charm and Diana's composure, lies a history of concealment, of politics hidden and then proudly admitted, of a mother who could not love 6 daughters equally, of a father who lost his fortune and then lost his mind, of a brother who joined the British Army in order to escape his sisters, of a daughter who shot herself in a Munich park on the day her country declared war on the country whose leader she adored, and of a family house that all 6 daughters, at the end of their lives, still called Swinbrook, because it was the word their mother had heard them all use as children and had corrected. And they had never let her correct it again. The Mitford sisters are where 20th century England went to watch its own upper class come apart in public. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which family, estate, or hidden history we should explore next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a father who never intended to inherit. David Bertram Ogilvy Freeman Mitford was born in 1878, the second son of the first Lord Redesdale, a diplomat and traveller who had written the best-selling Memories of a Diplomatic Life and who had introduced Japanese literature to Victorian England. David was not expected to inherit the barony. His elder brother Clement was the heir. David was therefore educated to be a country gentleman of no consequence, which was what, at the age of 24 in 1902, he was. He was handsome, charming, uneducated beyond the basics of Eton, deeply conservative, violently bad-tempered, afraid of books, afraid of foreigners, afraid of Roman Catholics, and in love with a 17-year-old heiress named Sydney Bowles, daughter of the founder of Vanity Fair and The Lady. They married in 1904. Sydney was sensible, silent, a little cold, and the daughter of money made in publishing. David had no money to speak of. He had a small allowance from his father and a prospect, if his brother died childless, of a moderate country estate. In October 1915, his brother Clement, serving in the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, was killed in action on the Western Front. David inherited. He became, in January 1916, on his own father's death, second Baron Redesdale, with a set of Cotswold estates centred on the Elizabethan manor of Batsford Park in Gloucestershire, a house the family loved but could not afford. David sold it in 1919. With the proceeds, he bought a smaller manor 5 miles away, Asthall Manor, near Burford, on the edge of the Windrush Valley. Asthall was perfect. It was 17th century, stone-built, with 5 reception rooms, a dozen bedrooms, a walled garden, and immediate access to the river. The family moved in April 1919. Nancy was 14, Pam was 12, Tom was 10, Diana was 8, Unity was 4, Jessica was 2. Deborah had not yet been born. Asthall was where the family legend began. It was also where the family's private language was invented. Nancy and Pam, as the eldest, developed a set of nicknames that would outlast them all. Their father became Fav, their mother became Muv, Tom became Tudamy, Diana was Honks, or Bodley, or Cord, Unity was Bowed, Jessica was Decker, or Little D, Deborah was Debo, or 9, because she was 9 when Nancy published her first novel, and Nancy thought the age suited her. Their private language, which Nancy and Unity developed between 1922 and 1929, and which the middle sisters spoke fluently for the rest of their lives, was called Boudledidge. It consisted of baby talk variants of standard English, produced entirely through the nose, with key vowel substitutions, and a catalogue of invented onomatopoeia for family events. Boudledidge could be understood only by those who had grown up speaking it. It was, in every meaningful sense, a family Creole. At Asthall, Nancy fell in love with reading. At Asthall, Tom fell in love with music. At Asthall, Diana, who had the looks of a Greek statue from the age of 8, fell in love with the idea of being beautiful. At Asthall, Unity fell in love with her own imagination. At Asthall, Jessica began to suspect that her family was ridiculous. And at Asthall, Deborah was born in 1920 into an atmosphere of teasing, boiled eggs, and the kind of casual anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, anti-foreign conservatism that passed for political opinion in most English gentry families of the period, and that would, in 4 of the Mitford children, metastasize into something catastrophic in the next decade. Then, in 1926, Favre did a thing that every one of his children, and particularly his daughters, would never forgive him for. He sold Asthall. He sold it in order to build a new house on the hill above Swinbrook village, roughly a mile away. He had been planning the new house for some years. Asthall, he had decided, was not quite grand enough for a peer of his position. He wanted something larger, plainer, more modern, and entirely of his own commission. He hired a local builder in Burford. The plans were drawn. Construction began in 1925. The family moved in late 1926. The new house was called Swinbrook. It was instantly loathed. Nancy called it the Swinebrook from the moment she first saw the drawings. All 6 sisters agreed. It was a plain, square, grey stone block of a house with 7 chimneys, 2 stories, and no architectural distinction whatsoever. It had no gardens because Favre had not bothered to commission any. It had no library to speak of. It had no river views because the house faced away from the Windrush. It smelt of new paint and new plaster and drying lime wash for the first 2 years the family lived in it. And it occupied the place in the daughter's memories where Asthall had been and would not let go. The decade the Mitford sisters spent at Swinbrook, from 1926, when they moved in, to 1936, when Favre sold it, was the decade in which the six of them became six different people. Nancy, now in her early 20s, published her first novels and discovered she was funny, lethally so. She wrote her sisters into each of them. She took revenge and extracted revenge through fiction. Pam, the second daughter, preferred chickens to people, bought a farm in the Cotswolds with her sister's help, and married, rather unhappily, the physicist Derek Jackson in 1936. Pam would be the least political and the least scandalous of the six. She would also be the only one of them to live quietly. Diana was married in January 1929, at the age of 18, to Brian Guinness, the heir to the brewing fortune and himself a handsome, polite, serious young man. Diana was, by the consensus of every contemporary, the most beautiful woman of her generation in England. Her marriage was the society wedding of 1929. She had 2 small sons. She was rich, titled, beautiful, and at the age of 22, she met, at a dinner party in London in February 1932, a man called Sir Oswald Mosley. Mosley was a Labour MP who had broken away from the Labour government over unemployment policy in 1931 and had founded the new party. He was married. He had a mistress. He had a reputation already as the most dangerous man in English politics. Within 6 months, Diana had left Brian Guinness, broken up her marriage in public, and moved to a small flat in Eaton Square, where she would wait, patiently, for Mosley to be free to marry her. It would take 4 years. Lady Redesdale never spoke to Diana again for most of that period. Lord Redesdale cut her off without funds for most of the remainder. In October 1932, 8 months after Diana met Mosley, he founded the British Union of Fascists. He wore a black shirt. He addressed rallies. He spoke approvingly of Mussolini. By 1934, he was speaking approvingly of Hitler. On the 6th of October 1936, on the day before the Battle of Cable Street, Diana Guinness married Oswald Mosley at the home of Joseph Goebbels in Berlin. Adolf Hitler attended the wedding. The wedding was kept secret from the British press for 2 years. Diana's younger sister had, by 1936, already gone further. Unity Valkyrie Mitford had been born in 1914 and had been, from her earliest years, the most imaginative, the most obsessive, and the most erratic of the six. She had been the sister who played with the family swastika quilts decades before anyone had heard of Nazis because she liked the pattern. She had been the sister who wrote her name in invented alphabets. She had been the sister who could recite the entire line of German emperors from Otto I at the age of 11. When Diana took up with Mosley in 1932 and began attending fascist rallies in London, Unity, who was 18, followed. She was introduced at Mosley's first Albert Hall rally to a cousin of the Rothermere family. She joined the BUF on the spot. In 1933, Unity went with Diana to Germany for the first time. In 1934, Unity began taking German lessons in London, specifically in order to be able to speak to Hitler if she ever met him. In April 1935, Unity, aged 20, moved to Munich alone, rented a small flat on a street she knew Hitler used regularly between the Reichskanzlei and the Braunhaus, and sat every day from noon to 4 in a restaurant called the Osteria Bavaria, which Hitler had adopted as his lunch venue until he noticed her. He noticed her in May. He invited her to join his table. Over the following 4.5 years, between 1935 and September 1939, Unity Mitford sat at Hitler's lunch table in Munich more than 140 times, became one of his more visible English acolytes, and was photographed repeatedly at Nuremberg rallies. Then, on the 3rd of September 1939, at approximately 1 p.m., as Britain and Germany formally entered a state of war, Unity Mitford walked to the Englischer Garten in Munich, sat on a bench near the Kleinhäuserloh Hussee, took a small ivory-handled pistol from her handbag and shot herself in the temple. She did not die. The bullet lodged in the back of her head, too close to the brainstem to be operated on. She survived in a coma for 8 weeks and then returned slowly to partial consciousness. She was repatriated to England in January 1940 on a stretcher through Switzerland with Hitler's personal authorization. She lived on at Swinbrook and then at the family's remote island of Inchkenneth in the Hebrides in a state of permanent intellectual reduction. She could sing. She could remember the names of her childhood ponies. She could recite parts of the German imperial line. She could not read or write. She lived until 1948, when the bullet that had failed to kill her in 1939 eventually caused a fatal infection. She was 33. On the 30th of May, 1940, 8 weeks after Unity arrived home, Diana Mosley was arrested at her house in Staffordshire and interned under Defence Regulation 18B of the Emergency Powers Act. She was held in Holloway Prison for the next 3.5 years. She was released to house arrest in November 1943 on the grounds of ill health. She was not prosecuted. She was not tried. She was held without charge because the British government had decided, correctly, that she was likely to transmit intelligence of any kind to Nazi Germany if she was left at liberty. In the same period, Jessica ran away. She was the 5th of the 6 daughters. She had grown up at Swinbrook, reading communist pamphlets her father believed were novels about farming. In February 1937, at the age of 19, she eloped with her second cousin, Esmond Romilly, a nephew of Winston Churchill's and a communist volunteer with the International Brigades in the Spanish Civil War. The Daily Express ran a front-page headline, "Peer's daughter elopes with Red cousin." Lord Redesdale swore that he would cut Jessica off forever, which he did, and that he would never speak her name again, which he largely did not. Esmond was killed in action, serving in the Royal Canadian Air Force in November 1941 over the North Sea. Jessica, by that point living in Washington, D.C., never returned to England to live. She became a committed Communist Party member in the United States, wrote the bestseller The American Way of Death in 1963, and died in Oakland, California in 1996. Deborah, the youngest, met the second son of the 10th Duke of Devonshire in 1938. She was 18. Andrew Cavendish was 17. They became engaged in 1940 and married in 1941. Andrew's elder brother, Billy Cavendish, who had married Kathleen Kennedy in May 1944, was killed in action in Belgium in September 1944. Andrew became the heir to Chatsworth. He succeeded as 11th Duke of Devonshire in 1950. Deborah became Duchess of Devonshire. Over the next half-century, she would, with her husband, save Chatsworth from the death duties that had destroyed so many other English stately homes. She would also write a series of memoirs about a family she described, with the clearest eye of any of her sisters, as the least boring family I have ever met, and the most damaged. Tom Mitford, the only brother, had gone into the army in 1939. He had, in the late 1930s, been unambiguously sympathetic to the Nazi politics of his sisters, Diana and Unity. He had attended Nuremberg rallies. He had written to Diana expressing admiration for Mosley. When war broke out, he asked specifically to serve in any theatre that was not European, because he wrote to a friend in 1939, he could not bring himself to fire on the German people. He was posted to Burma. He served competently and without ideology in the 2nd Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. On the 30th of March, 1945, as the British 14th Army advanced across the Irrawaddy, Tom Mitford was shot in the stomach by a Japanese sniper. He died of his wounds a week later, on the 1st of April, 1945. He was 36. He is buried at the Kranji War Memorial in Singapore. His name is listed with those of the other missing and identified soldiers of the Burma campaign, among thousands. At Swinbrook, Lord and Lady Redesdale heard the news by telegram on the 5th of April, 1945. Lord Redesdale did not speak for 2 days. Lady Redesdale wrote in her journal, in the only sentence in the entire journal about the event, T. died. Cannot bear it. The father who had sold Asthall to build Swinbrook had by this point lost most of the family fortune. He had also, after 1938, separated effectively from Lady Redesdale. He retreated to the Mitford island of Inchkenneth, a tiny Hebridean property the family had owned since 1938, where he lived alone, in increasing mental confusion, until his death in 1958. He died believing, according to a carer, that his eldest daughter Nancy had visited him the day before, although Nancy had not been in Scotland in 12 years. Lady Redesdale lived on at Inchkenneth. She died in 1963. She had, by that point, outlived her only son and her second daughter. She would in due course also outlive Nancy, who died of cancer in 1973, Diana, who died in 2003, and Pam, who died in 1994. Would survive as the last Mitford sister until 2014. But the two houses where the Mitford sisters grew up were not built by the sisters whose letters made them famous. Their presence at Asthall and at Swinbrook is documented, recorded in ink on paper in the family's own letters, in the Redesdale estate accounts, and in the Mitford servants' wage book, now held at Chatsworth alongside Deborah Cavendish's papers. Their stories are not. There was a nanny called Laura Dix, known to the family as Nanny Blore, who had been engaged in 1910 as nurse to Diana and who stayed with the Mitfords for 40 years. She cared for Unity, Jessica, and Deborah in turn. She travelled with Lord Redesdale to Canada in the 1920s as the family's housekeeper. She retired in 1950 to a small cottage in Burford, which Nancy paid for in perpetuity. Nanny Blore died in 1971, aged 91, having outlived two of her charges. Her letters to Deborah, written weekly between 1941 and 1968, survive in the Chatsworth archive. They are never quoted in Mitford biographies because nobody has yet transcribed them. There was a chauffeur called Robert Turner who drove the Mitford children to school, on holiday, and to London railway stations between 1921 and 1938. His name appears in the Redesdale wage book 9 times a year for 17 years. He was paid 28 shillings a week. He married the upper housemaid, Edith Miles, in 1930 at Swinbrook Village Church. Edith left service to raise their 3 children. Robert continued to drive for the family until Lord Redesdale dismissed him in 1938 during the estate's bankruptcy adjacent retrenchment. Robert worked thereafter as a postman in Burford until his death in 1961. His grandson, still alive in Oxfordshire, possesses the black leather driving gloves he wore on the 1923 drive to bring Unity home from her christening at her godmother's house in London. There was a cook called Annie Sellers, who worked in the Swinbrook kitchen from 1926 to 1936, and who is the unnamed Mrs. S in approximately 47 letters between Nancy and Jessica. She was famous in the sisters' correspondence for her boiled eggs and her loathing of Lady Redesdale's preference for uncooked vegetables. She retired in 1937 when Swinbrook was sold. She lived in Burford. She received, every Christmas until her death in 1962, a hamper from Deborah at Chatsworth, a practice Deborah continued without ever, in any published correspondence, mentioning it. They appear in the records as footnotes: a name beside a sum, a letter without a surname, a quarterly wage entered into the Redesdale ledger, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great family who is not a member of the family. We do not know their faces. We do not know how most of them saw the children they raised. We know only that they were there, that the letters survive, and that their names survived, some of them because the Mitfords wrote down everything and Deborah kept it. Nancy wrote the most famous novels in the family. Other women raised her and her sisters. The house absorbed both. Swinbrook House was sold by Lord Redesdale in 1936. It passed through several private owners during the Second World War and after. It is today still in private hands, not open to the public. Asthall Manor, which the family had sold in 1926, was bought in 1997 by Rosie Pearson, who restored the house and its garden, and who now runs it as a centre for small-scale sculpture and literary events. The family island of Inchkenneth was sold in 1966 after Lady Redesdale's death. Both Cotswold houses are, at the level of bricks and mortar, intact. Both are curated in ways the Mitford daughters never imagined. And in the churchyard at St. Mary the Virgin, Swinbrook, half a mile from the house the sisters called Swinbrook, 6 graves record the dates and the names, but not the politics. Stand in the churchyard at Swinbrook on a November afternoon. Stand in the churchyard at Swinbrook on a November afternoon, with the windrush running past the old mill and the sun going down behind the Cotswold escarpment, and you see what every Mitford reader has seen on the pilgrimage: 4 headstones in a loose row and 2 alongside, with the surname Mitford on 5 of them and the surname Mosley on 1. Nancy, Unity, Diana, Pamela, Lady Redesdale, Lord Redesdale. 6 names, 6 decades of letters between them, 6 versions of a childhood at Asthall and at Swinbrook. But look closer and the picture complicates. Not one of the graves mentions politics. Not one mentions the brother buried 7,000 miles away in Singapore. Not one records the daughters who live still in California and London at the time the older stones were cut. The whole row is a curated erasure, a country churchyard reading of a family that, in life, could not have agreed on anything, and, in death, agreed to say as little as possible. The Mitfords are not one family. They are the record, in letters and books and silence, of what an English gentry family of the 20th century could not fit inside the official story of itself. Lord Redesdale wanted a son who would be conservative, and a line of daughters who would marry conservatives. The Second World War took his son in Burma and left him with 2 daughters in Nazi Germany and 1 in American communism. Lady Redesdale wanted 6 quiet daughters who loved each other. The daughters fought politically and privately for 50 years, and some of them would not attend each other's funerals. Nancy wanted a literary career. She got one, and it rested on the humiliation of everyone in her family. Diana wanted Mosley. She got him, and she spent 3.5 years in Holloway as a result. Unity wanted Hitler. She got him, lunching for 4.5 years, and she shot herself at the moment the 2 men she loved most, her father and her Führer, declared war on each other. Jessica wanted revolution. She got America. Deborah wanted Chatsworth. She got Chatsworth. Tom wanted to be neither English nor German. He died in Burma. The houses absorbed every one of them. That is their genius, and that is their cost, because what Swinbrook and Asthall and the Mitford papers have also preserved in the quarterly wage books and the nanny's letters and the unpublished cook's hamper acknowledgements is the names of the Laura Dixes and the Annie Sellises and the Robert Turners, without whom no 6 sisters could have grown up into the 6 women they became. The Mitfords are a book industry. The women who raised them are a footnote in a ledger kept in Chatsworth. The Mitford estate asks the same question that all great houses ask. Who does a family belong to? The parents who bred it, the daughters who defined it in print, the nanny who raised every one of them for 40 years and whose grave the sisters paid for but did not attend, the 6 graves in the churchyard, the 3 million copies of The Pursuit of Love sold in Britain alone, the hundreds of thousands of readers who still follow the letters, or the valley itself, the windrush, the Cotswold stone, the mud paths, the sheep-cropped hills. That was here before any Mitford had a title and will be here long after the last biography is published. Swinbrook does not answer. The house never answers. It simply stands, unloved and privately owned, a field from the churchyard where 4 of the sisters are buried, and lets you decide. And on the lowest line of Unity's gravestone, below the birth date of 1914 and the death date of 1948, there is a word in a private alphabet her older sisters could read, a single, invented Boudledidge character, which her siblings carved into the stone when the mason was finished because they could not let her go into the ground without the family language she had helped to invent. The mason never knew what the character meant. Nobody does now. It is still there. They are all still up there. They always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a family differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.